Joining me now, Pixar's chairman and CEO, Steve Jobs.
Steve Jobs. Most of you know him as the former co-founder and CEO of Apple Computers. During his time at Apple, he was able to help the company create revolutionary products such as the Apple II, the iPod, the iPhone, the iPad, iTunes, and much more. Eventually, his net worth grew to $10 billion thanks to his part ownership of Apple. Except that isn't true, because Steve Jobs made most of his fortune creating another company. A company that helped revolutionize the film industry and animation software while helping entertain millions of kids around the world. You see, when most people hear about the story of Steve Jobs, they usually only hear the parts that relate to Apple, like building the first Apple computer from a garage in Palo Alto in 1976. Or then you hear about the part where he was fired from Apple in 1985. Occasionally, you will hear about the part when he started NEXT Computers weeks after leaving Apple. Then finally, you hear about the part where he returned to Apple in 1997, and the rest is history. But there is a big 12-year gap which you don't hear about a lot. That is what this video is about. The 12-year gap where he created Pixar. The year was 1985. Back when Madonna had the #1 song in the country, the average house price was $40,000, Back to the Future was the #1 movie in the country, and Apple's new product, the Macintosh, was just released to the public.
But today, for the first time ever, I'd like to let Macintosh speak for itself.
Hello, I am Macintosh. It sure is great to get out of that bag.
However, during this time, Apple was a divided company. Steve Jobs led one division of Apple that wanted to focus exclusively on closed architecture computers like the Macintosh. Meanwhile, most of the board of directors and former Apple CEO John Sculley wanted to focus more on open architecture computers like the Apple II. This led to a feud which resulted in Jobs resigning from the company. In his resignation letter, he stated, "Dear Mike, this morning's paper carried suggestions that Apple is considering removing me as chairman. I don't know the source of these reports, but they are both misleading to the public and unfair to me. You will recall that at last Thursday's board meeting, I stated I had decided to start a new venture, and I tendered my resignation as chairman. As you know, the company's recent reorganization left me with no work to do and no access to even regular management reports. I am but 30 and still want to contribute and achieve. After what we have accomplished together, I would wish our parting to be both amicable and dignified. Yours sincerely, Stephen Jobs, September 17th, 1985. Shortly after Jobs left Apple, he sold all but one of his 9,900,091 shares of Apple. The reason why he kept one share of Apple was so that he could get their annual report and even attend their annual shareholders meeting if he wanted to. But what this meant was that Jobs sold his entire stake in Apple and took home roughly $140 million from this transaction in 1985. Jobs then started two new ventures within the next 6 months, one of which was NEXT Computers. I will save that for another video, but NEXT was a computer company that played a significant role in the creation of the modern internet and the development of modern operating systems. The other venture that Steve Jobs started after leaving Apple was called Pixar. But that needs some backstory. 6 years earlier, in 1979, a young director named George Lucas was looking for a new graphics team to work on his next movie called The Empire Strikes Back. So he hired a group of young computer scientists and called their division the Graphics Group. During their time at Lucasfilms, they pioneered some of the foundational computer graphics tools, such as the Alpha Channel. The group began to work on other movies such as Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan and Young Sherlock Holmes. But in 1986, George Lucas began running into some financial troubles from a recent divorce and because Star Wars royalties were declining. He knew he would likely have to sell the graphics group division of Lucasfilms. So, George Lucas and the heads of the graphics group began looking for investors. Steve Jobs initially sent in an offer that was declined by Lucas because he thought it was too low. But after being rejected by 45 other venture capitalists and corporations, the graphics group accepted Steve Jobs' offer, which was worth a total of $10 million in exchange for a minority stake in the newly formed independent company that they called Pixar. The initial goal of the company after Jobs' acquisition was to make the first feature-length computer-animated movie. However, they soon realized that computing power at the time was not advanced enough to handle the task of creating an entire movie. This meant that they had to pivot quickly to another source of revenue to keep the company alive. So Pixar decided to focus on making and selling computer hardware, something that Steve Jobs already had a little bit of experience doing. They soon released a computer called the Pixar Image Computer. It was an extremely high-end computer that was way ahead of its time, and was mostly suitable for sectors that needed lots of visualization, such as medicine, meteorology, and animation. The computer's price tag was a hefty $135,000, and one of the only buyers happened to be the Walt Disney Company. Disney also ended up buying some of Pixar's software, which forced them to form a long-term relationship with one another. This was one of Pixar and Disney's first collaborations together and would prove to be an important first step in a massive relationship, but we will come back to that in a minute. Pixar eventually made two second-generation computers called the P2 and a higher-end version called the P2-9. These computers were state-of-the-art and were used in some hospitals throughout the United States. However, the number of Pixar computers sold in the first few years was about 300. It was enough revenue to provide a temporary financial buffer for the company, but Pixar kept losing money. At this point, Steve Jobs knew he had two options. The first of which was to let the company fail so that he could focus his resources more towards his other company, Next Computers. The second was to invest more money into Pixar to keep it afloat. He chose the second option. He ended up reinvesting about $50 million into Pixar and owned more than 75% of the company, meaning that he was now the majority owner of Pixar. Many years later, Steve Jobs was asked about his decision to keep investing more money into Pixar. He said, "If I knew in 1986 how much it was going to cost to keep Pixar going, I doubt if I would have bought the company." Jobs, along with the president of Pixar, Edwin Catmull, and head of animation, John Lasseter, decided to focus more on the software and animation part of the business. So, Pixar sold its hardware division, including all proprietary hardware technology and imaging software, to Vicom Systems. Pixar's next move was to release some software tools on both the Windows system and the Macintosh. Its biggest releases were RenderMan and Typistry, which let users make 3D objects and text. By 1991, despite selling over 100,000 copies of their software, neither of these software tools produced enough revenue to keep the company afloat, and Pixar was once again in financial trouble. The company had laid off more than half of its employees, which brought the number of employees down to just 42, and brought the number of software programmers down to less than 30. However, Disney had been keeping in close contact with Pixar over the previous several years, which allowed John Lasseter to pitch to Disney about funding a 1-hour 3D animated TV movie. Disney initially rejected the offer, but came back with a bigger counteroffer. Disney wanted Pixar to make an animated feature-length Hollywood film which would be distributed by Disney. The conditions were Disney would pick up most of the production and promotion costs as long as they had complete control over marketing and licensing the films and their characters. Another condition was that Pixar would create the screenplays and visual style for each picture and receive 12.5% of the box office gross revenues and video sales. The last condition was Disney had the option to contract Pixar to make 2 additional films under the same terms. Both sides ended up agreeing to these conditions, and they made a deal. Pixar began working on a screenplay for their first feature film, but the company was still losing money as a whole. Steve Jobs actually contemplated selling Pixar to several big business players such as Hallmark, Paul Allen, who was the co-founder of Microsoft, and his friend, Oracle CEO Larry Ellison. But Jobs held off on selling the company until he had a feeling of whether the first feature film would be a box office hit or a box office flop.
And that brings us to 1995, the centenary year of the invention of the motion picture itself. We have another major milestone, something I think will go down as a landmark in motion picture history. The first completely computer-generated feature-length motion picture. And that, of course, is Toy Story. Toy Story has been written, directed, and produced by Pixar in a partnership with the Walt Disney Company. and we can see how it turns out at Thanksgiving.
Luckily, the first film that Pixar started making was called Toy Story. A rough copy of Toy Story was seen by Steve Jobs and test audiences in early 1995, and the reception was encouraging enough that Disney planned to release Toy Story during the holiday season of 1995. Upon hearing the news, Jobs decided that he would actually take Pixar public on the stock market 1 week after Toy Story was released. Jobs said in an interview, "If Toy Story is a modest hit, say $75 million at the box office, we'll both break even. If it gets $100 million at the box office, we'll both make money. But if it's a real blockbuster and earns $200 million or so at the box office, we'll make good money and Disney will make a lot of money." At this point, Steve Jobs knew that Pixar's initial public offering would be entirely dependent on how well the movie performed at the box office. So, Toy Story would be a make or break for the company. But as you know, Toy Story ended up being a massive hit and became the #1 movie in the world in its opening week. Because of this, Pixar's IPO followed suit, where it became the largest initial public offering of 1995. That morning, Jobs was huddled around a computer in San Francisco watching the stock. As the price soared, an investment banker in the room turned to Jobs and said, "Congratulations, Steve, you're a billionaire." Jobs later stepped out of the room and called his friend and Oracle founder, Larry Ellison, to say, "Larry, I made it." That's right, Steve Jobs did not become a billionaire from Apple. He became a billionaire from Pixar. After Toy Story's massive $337 million box office run, Pixar made enough money not just to stay afloat, but to build an entire studio campus in Emeryville, California. Many of Steve Jobs' peers said that Pixar changed Jobs as a person. Allegedly, he became slightly more fun and funny as a person, while becoming more collaborative as a businessman. Before Pixar, Steve Jobs was known as a control freak at Apple that wanted to design every aspect of every single product. But as former CFO of Pixar, Lawrence Levi, said, he wasn't the product maker at Pixar. He wasn't a filmmaker. In 1997, Apple saw the success of what Steve Jobs did at Pixar and liked the operating system that his other company, NEXT, had made. So, Apple bought NEXT Computers for $429 million and appointed Steve Jobs as the CEO of Apple. They also gave him shares of Apple, which gave him about 0.6% ownership of the company. At the time, that was only worth a few $1,000,000. Over the next 9 years, Steve Jobs remained as both the CEO of Apple and the owner of Pixar. During that time, Apple had released 2 popular new products in the iMac and the iPod, while Pixar produced 6 hit movies in A Bug's Life, Toy Story 2, Monsters, Inc., Finding Nemo, The Incredibles, and Cars. Everything was on the up and up for Steve Jobs' 2 companies. Now, despite Disney and Pixar making a series of blockbuster movies from 1995 to 2006, Disney and Pixar had over a decade-long feud where they both kept disputing the initial contract that they had signed in 1991. In fact, by 2005, it looked like Pixar and Disney might never collaborate on a movie again. That was until Disney hired a new CEO and made the decision to end the 15-year-long contract feud with Pixar by attempting to buy the entire animation company and make it a Disney subsidiary. Both companies agreed to a deal where Disney would acquire Pixar for $7.4 billion in an all-stock deal. The deal was completed on May 5th, 2006. After the acquisition, Steve Jobs became the largest shareholder of Disney, owning nearly 7% of the entire Walt Disney Company. At the time, that was worth about $3.9 billion and would be worth almost $6 billion at the time of his death in late 2011. So what does this all mean? It means that Steve Jobs, the co-founder of Apple, the revolutionary tech CEO who helped personal computing, portable music, and smartphones land on the map worldwide, he made more money building an animation company that most people never knew he built than he did at Apple Computers. And that is the story of how Steve Jobs actually made his fortune. It was not from Apple, it was from Pixar.
Pixar is seen by a lot of folks as an overnight success, but if you really look closely, most overnight successes took a long time.
And thank you very much for watching. Remember to hit that subscribe button if you want to see some more videos like this. I have a few more that I have made that will be coming out in the coming few weeks. And hit that like button if you did like this video. But thank you very much for watching. You're all very beautiful people. I'll see you guys in the next video.